The moment I pulled into my own driveway and saw a complete stranger waving at me like I was the intruder, I knew something was very, very wrong. The guy stood there, leaning on a rusted-out van with a duffel bag tossed over one shoulder and a folding chair on the other, acting like he owned the place. "Hey man, you got the Wi-Fi password?" he asked, as if this was a hotel. I stared at him, stunned, scanning the second car. A beat-up Dodge Challenger blasting music with the windows down, its trunk cracked open revealing what looked like parts of another car. I stepped out slowly, still in uniform pants from an overnight operation, my shirt draped over my arm, and said, "Excuse me, but what the hell are you doing in my driveway?" His reply was infuriating and ridiculous in equal parts. "The HOA said this spot's mine for the week. I paid for it on Zelle." That was the exact second I knew someone was playing a game they weren't ready for. And the worst part? That someone was Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA. And she had no idea she just set up a criminal operation on the driveway of the county sheriff. I'd only been home 5 minutes before my wife came storming out of the house, red-faced and boiling with frustration. She'd already called me 3 times during my drive back from the field, but I couldn't answer while debriefing. She pointed to the 2 strangers lounging in our front area like it was a shared Airbnb. One was tapping away on a laptop on top of our trash bin. The other had plugged something into our outdoor outlet, actually using our power. I walked over, phone already recording, and asked for clarification again. "Karen handled it," the man with the laptop said. Said it was a community spot she was leasing out to help raise funds for the HOA. Called it the Driveway Equity Program. Cool idea, honestly. I could barely breathe from the level of disbelief. I walked back toward my garage, opened it, and checked my home camera footage. They'd arrived around 6 a.m. One of them had even tried the front door before realizing we were home. This wasn't just disrespect. It was criminal trespassing. And worse? One of these renters was already on our county watch list for illegal auto parts sales. What Karen didn't know, what nobody in this neighborhood knew, was that I was more than just the guy who mowed his lawn with military precision. I was the county sheriff, recently transferred to a quieter district while still running field operations under the radar. I chose to keep it low-key here so I wouldn't be flooded with petty neighbor complaints or get sucked into the usual HOA politic. But now Karen had dragged me into her twisted little empire of forged leases and phony bylaws. And she'd done it by selling access to my property, without my permission, to complete strangers who might be tied to actual crimes. Before confronting her, I needed to be sure. I stepped inside, opened my encrypted laptop, and ran the plates I saw on the vehicles. One came back clean. The other? Suspended registration, last seen connected to a chop shop bust in the neighboring county. I called a buddy from the task force, gave him the name from the Zelle receipt the renter had stupidly shown me, and within minutes got confirmation. This guy was connected to an ongoing operation. That sealed it. Not only was Karen illegally leasing property she didn't own, but she was also unknowingly harboring felons under the umbrella of her self-made HOA initiative. I was stunned by the sheer stupidity. I poured myself coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and let out a slow laugh. My wife, still furious, asked what was so funny. "Oh, nothing," I said. "I just realized I've got probable cause to raid my own driveway." Still, I wanted to give Karen a chance to explain herself before the hammer dropped. I grabbed my badge, still tucked in my sock drawer like always, and headed out to the HOA clubhouse. It wasn't even a proper building, just a converted tool shed painted beige, but Karen stood outside it like she was guarding the Pentagon. "Can I help you?" she asked with a sneer, sunglasses pushed down the bridge of her nose. "We're in the middle of a board session." I told her calmly about the 2 men parked on my driveway. Her expression didn't change. "Yes, I arranged that," she said. "They signed the community parking lease. You weren't using it, and we needed to raise funds for the pool heater upgrades. It's all in the bylaws." She held up a crumpled stack of printed Word documents, none of which bore an actual signature, date, or legal stamp. You leased my private driveway to strangers for cash? I repeated. It's not just your driveway anymore, she said, smugly. Under HOA Policy 17B, shared use agreements allow for reassignment of underutilized spaces. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I smiled and nodded. All right then, I said. Let's go ahead and document everything properly. Can you send me the full list of other leased driveways, the payment logs, and a copy of that policy you cited? Her smile faltered. It's not all digitized yet. I'll have to get back to you. She wouldn't get that chance. By the time I returned home, I had already notified the county legal department and my internal investigations team. I filed a formal complaint through the sheriff's office, but kept it internal to avoid tipping her off too soon. This wasn't just about reclaiming my driveway anymore. Karen had opened the floodgates to a larger scheme, leasing driveways, maybe even backyards, collecting untraceable money, and doing it under fake policies. If I played this smart, she'd not only be removed from the HOA board but possibly face charges for property fraud, impersonation of legal authority, and facilitating illegal commerce. That night, as the sun set over our quiet cul-de-sac, the two renters finally packed up and drove off, probably spooked by the marked patrol car I had asked a friend to casually park across the street. I watched from the window, arms crossed, already planning the next move. Karen had no idea she had picked the one neighbor in the entire county who had the legal power and tactical backup to bring her whole scheme crashing down. But she was about to learn, the hard way, that you don't lease out the sheriff's driveway and get away with it. The next morning started with the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. No engine revving, no strangers loitering on my driveway, no smell of cheap cigarette smoke wafting through the window. It was the kind of quiet that told me someone knew they had screwed up. But that silence didn't mean Karen had backed off. No, it meant she was recalculating, spinning her little wheels to figure out how to salvage her power. I could feel it, and I had no doubt she'd be back with a bigger, dumber idea. So I decided to get ahead of it. If she wanted to pretend she had the legal ground to lease my property, I'd treat this like any other operation. I wasn't just going to shut her down, I was going to dismantle every inch of the scam she was running under the HOA's name. I dressed like a civilian and walked to the HOA clubhouse for the scheduled board meeting. I wasn't technically on the board, but I had attended a few when we first moved in, mainly to ensure there weren't any strange policies in the works. That meeting was less of a council and more of a Karen-led monologue. She stood at the center like she was campaigning for mayor, flanked by two board members who looked half asleep and another who was clearly just there for the free donuts. Karen was already mid-pitch when I stepped in. "It's a beautiful day to talk about progress," she declared. "Thanks to the Driveway Equity Program, we've raised $1,400 in just 2 weeks." Murmurs of approval buzzed through the room. I raised my hand. She ignored me. I raised it higher. She finally gave a tight-lipped smile and nodded. "Yes, question from the audience?" I stood up and asked for clarification on the Driveway Equity Program. Who approved it? Where was the signed resolution? Were there property owners who gave explicit permission? Karen's smile stiffened. Well, as acting president of the HOA, I initiated the pilot phase under emergency discretionary action. I asked her to cite that authority. She stuttered slightly before motioning to a pile of papers. "It's all there. We're just waiting for final sign-off. But it's operational and producing revenue, so we considered it grandfathered in." I recorded the entire exchange on my phone, discreetly tucked in my front pocket. I didn't expect the sleepy board to push back, but this was still useful. Especially when one member whispered to me afterward, "I didn't vote for this. I thought it was a garage sale fundraiser." With her paper-thin defense unraveling, I knew it was time to start collecting hard evidence. That afternoon, I installed additional cameras around my property, small, unnoticeable ones that covered the driveway, mailbox, and even the side path that led to the HOA shed. I also reviewed the footage from the last week. The number of strangers casually using my property was disturbing. One man had plugged a power strip into my exterior outlet and charged 4 phones. Another had opened a folding chair and fallen asleep right next to my porch railing. One even used my garden hose to wash his bumper. I wasn't just dealing with Karen's power trip, I was seeing the birth of a full-blown cash-for-access scheme. And worse, at least one of the vehicles caught on camera had mismatched plate. I ran the tags again. This one had been flagged in a hit-and-run report last month. This wasn't just HOA overreach anymore. This was crossing into the world of criminal liability. I sat down that evening and compiled a full report, complete with photos, license plate matches, camera timestamps, and audio from the board meeting. I sent it to the Sheriff's Internal Investigations Unit and tagged it as potential felony facilitation via HOA misuse. Within the hour, I got a response. One of our analysts had already flagged the name from the Zelle receipt in a different ongoing investigation. The driveway renter Karen had brought in wasn't just connected to stolen auto parts. He was suspected of being the middleman for a catalytic converter ring operating across county lines. That detail clicked like a lock turning. My driveway wasn't just a rental, it was a drop site. Still, I wanted to see how far Karen would push this, so I gave her a little rope. The next morning, I left my car parked halfway across the driveway, effectively blocking any new renters from setting up shop. Sure enough, within 2 hours, Karen knocked on my door, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like she was auditioning for a soap opera. "We had a lease scheduled today," she chirped. "You're blocking the guest space." I asked who the guest was. She flipped through her clipboard, hesitated, and gave a name I recognized from the system. A known associate of the converter ring. I told her I wouldn't be moving my car. Her lips tightened. "Then I'll have to issue a citation for noncompliance. It's all documented." She handed me a slip of paper, clearly printed at home, with an HOA header she must have designed in Canva. It had zero legal authority. Still, I accepted it with a smile. "Thanks," I said. "Every piece of documentation helps." That evening, I got a text from my partner in the investigations unit. They were authorizing a preliminary sting setup, using my property as a live feed source for tracking criminal movement. If I agreed, they'd dispatch surveillance units nearby. I didn't hesitate. I told them to proceed. My home was now part of a county-sanctioned investigation. The very space Karen thought she was monetizing was about to become the trap that caught her red-handed. In the meantime, Karen wasn't done flexing. She started putting up little signs around the neighborhood. Community parking zone, courtesy of HOA, pointing toward my home and 2 other driveways. One neighbor stormed over, asking why strangers were parking on his flower bed. Another had his driveway blocked entirely, his Amazon packages stacked on top of a stranger's sedan. Karen had gone full dictator. But what she didn't realize was that the deeper she pushed this, the harder it would snap back. I had already received 2 HOA board emails that were blind copied to me from disillusioned members. They didn't support the driveway initiative. Karen had doctored their votes, claimed consensus, and bypassed even basic procedural step. One email even hinted that she had started a private fund, calling it the HOA Success Reserve, but it was tied to a personal Venmo account. It was all unraveling. And the best part? She still thought she was untouchable. Still believed that her fake citations, her make-believe programs, and her clipboard of lies were strong enough to silence anyone who pushed back. But what she didn't see coming was the ticking time bomb right under her feet. Because while she issued phony parking permits, I was building a legal case with a ticking clock. The next few days would determine everything. If she stepped 1 inch further, if she leased that driveway one more time, if another felon pulled onto my property, she wouldn't just be facing an angry neighbor. She'd be facing the full force of the county sheriff's department, with cameras, warrants, and handcuffs ready. And she'd never see it coming. It didn't take long for Karen to respond to being boxed in. When she realized I wasn't going to budge, she switched gears from smug self-appointed leader to full-blown HOA tyrant. That same week, I received 3 separate violation notices from the HOA, each one more absurd than the last. The first accused me of vehicle hoarding, because I had my patrol SUV parked on the curb along with my wife's sedan in the driveway. The second claimed I was causing visual disruption with an unauthorized security fence, referring to the waist-high protective gate I installed when my toddler started walking. And the third, my personal favorite, stated I was creating air and noise pollution by operating what she described as law enforcement-grade equipment too close to residential properties. That piece of equipment, by the way, was a portable backup generator that hadn't even been turned on in weeks. She was throwing darts in the dark, hoping one would stick. But none of it mattered. I wasn't just collecting her missteps anymore. I was counting down to the moment she would bury herself in a grave dug entirely with her own clipboard. Even though the sting operation was officially greenlit, I didn't want to tip off the suspects too early. The longer they operated under the illusion of safety, the better our chances of linking all parties involved. I kept my car angled on the driveway to discourage new renters, and for a few days, things were quiet. Karen must have sensed that I was onto something because she ramped up the propaganda. Flyers started appearing on neighbors' doors, praising the HOA's bold new revenue strategy and encouraging homeowners to volunteer unused spaces for the Greater Good Parking Project. She even scheduled a community barbecue to celebrate our collective success. I RSVP'd just to watch her squirm, though I had no intention of eating anything she served. Something about someone who leases out your driveway to felons and then offers you grilled hot dogs just doesn't sit right. I wasn't the only one catching on. A neighbor named Jorge, who lived 2 doors down and usually kept to himself, showed up at my front door with a printout in hand. "This from your driveway?" he asked, pointing to a blurry photo of a car partially backed up across both our properties. I confirmed it and asked why. He said the same car had clipped his mailbox and taken off, then parked behind his garage for 20 minutes before disappearing. I ran the plates through internal systems, flagged. Again. That was the third vehicle in just 2 weeks connected to Karen's little leasing scam that turned out to be part of an open investigation. My frustration was starting to build, not because it was happening, but because she still had no clue the level of law she was toying with. And now innocent neighbors were starting to get caught in the fallout. That evening, I checked the footage from the hidden cameras I'd installed. One clip stood out. A kid on a scooter rolled up to the driveway, looked around, and handed a folded wad of cash to one of the renters. That same renter opened the trunk of his vehicle and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. The camera caught just enough for me to identify it as a catalytic converter. 2 hours later, that vehicle drove off and was replaced by another. They were using my driveway as a rotating exchange point. I sent the footage directly to the task force with a note. "They're accelerating. Time to set the clock." The following day, Karen delivered the final straw. I returned from work to find my driveway blocked by 2 orange traffic cones and a laminated sign that read, "Reserved HOA parking, violators will be fined." It looked official, but I knew it wasn't. I checked the back of the sign and saw the HOA letterhead taped on with double-sided tape. She had printed it herself. I snapped a photo and yanked the cones aside. But it was what happened 20 minutes later that pushed the whole situation into dangerous territory. A couple I didn't recognize pulled up in a badly dented truck and said they were here for the lease. When I told them it was canceled and the spot wasn't available, they got agitated. The woman pulled out her phone and showed me a message from a number saved as Karen HOA, confirming the address, payment amount, and duration. That was all the confirmation I needed. Karen was still renting out my space, illegally, despite the evidence stacking against her. And she had just brought in 2 more suspects into what was now a federal-level investigation. I called in the plate and was told to stall them. The team was already nearby. I casually chatted with the couple, pretending to be confused, while inside I gave the green light for surveillance units to move in. In less than 10 minutes, an unmarked van rolled down the block. 2 plainclothes officers exited calmly, introduced themselves, and began a soft interrogation under the guise of zoning checks. Within minutes, it became clear the truck was stolen. The VIN number didn't match the registration, and the bed was filled with metal parts hidden under tarp. Both individuals were detained. And all of it had started because Karen couldn't keep her hands off other people's property. Word spread fast. By evening, 2 board members had resigned. One emailed me apologizing and attached a folder of emails that showed Karen had never gotten formal approval for any of her initiatives. She had faked vote counts, written minutes herself, and used dummy emails to impersonate other board members during online decisions. In one particularly damning email chain, she bragged to a friend about how the sheriff guy is clueless and probably afraid to challenge the HOA. I read that line twice, laughed, and saved the entire chain into the case file. I wasn't just going to shut her down. I was going to bury every shred of her phony leadership under a mountain of evidence. But even after the arrests and resignations, Karen didn't stop. She doubled down. The next day, she hosted a Facebook Live session in the HOA group, claiming she was the victim of a targeted campaign by extremist neighbors, trying to undermine her progress. She said people were trying to silence strong women in leadership, and that she was being illegally surveilled. I watched it from my office and couldn't help but shake my head. This wasn't strength. It was delusion. She was spiraling, desperate to cling to the illusion of control while everything around her fell apart. But it didn't matter how loud she screamed or how many cones she placed on driveways that weren't hers. The final stage of the operation had already begun. The warrants were drafted. The arrest plans were scheduled. The only question now was how long she could keep her facade intact before the knock came on her door. And when it did, she wouldn't just be facing an angry neighbor. She'd be facing the county sheriff, with a badge, a file, and a pair of handcuffs. The operation was scheduled for 4 a.m., the hour when the neighborhood was at its quietest, the sky still navy blue, and the world felt half asleep. Most of the homes around here didn't stir until well after 7. That was what made it perfect. We had spent the past few days finalizing every detail. Surveillance teams were stationed in inconspicuous vans parked down the block. Patrol cruisers were placed just out of sight on the parallel road, and my house had been wired with a direct line to the task force's command center. Everything Karen thought she'd gotten away with had been recorded, cataloged, and confirmed. The fake leases, the money transfers, the criminal renters, and her fabricated HOA policies. It was all admissible, stacked in a folder thick enough to rattle when you shook it. She had no idea this would be the morning everything fell apart. She was probably still asleep, likely dreaming up her next citation against someone's mailbox color. But the next knock she'd hear wouldn't be from a neighbor, it would be from officers with warrants. At exactly 3:56 a.m., a beat-up silver truck pulled into my driveway. Just like clockwork. The driver killed the headlights and stepped out slowly, glancing around like he knew he shouldn't be there. He looked familiar, mid-30s, tattoos up his arms, and the kind of slouched gait you only see in people who've had more mugshots than paychecks. From the window, I recognized him as one of the suspects tied to the catalytic converter ring. He opened the truck bed and lifted a tarp, revealing exactly what we were expecting. Stacks of metal parts bundled in greasy rags. I whispered into the earpiece. The command center gave the green light. This was the final transaction we needed to trigger the takedown. Within seconds, 2 unmarked vehicles rolled into the block from both ends, blocking exit. The officers emerged in silence, weapons drawn but lowered, identifying themselves calmly. The suspect froze, tried to run, and was tackled in my front yard by a K-9 unit that barked only once before knocking him flat. It was fast, clean, and by the book. I stepped outside in my uniform, finally visible, and nodded to the lead arresting officer. "He's yours," I said. The man, handcuffed and face down in the grass, looked up in confusion. "You live here?" he asked. I nodded again. "Yeah. And I'm also the county sheriff." His eyes widened as the realization hit. Karen had been so busy selling driveways she never thought to ask who they belonged to. The ruckus had stirred the neighborhood. Porch lights flicked on one by one, sleepy residents stepping out in robes and slippers. That's when Karen finally appeared. Her porch light blinked on and she stormed out wearing a lavender robe, phone in hand, already recording. "What is going on?" she demanded, zooming in on the flashing lights and uniformed officers swarming the block. "You people can't just raid our community like this without authorization from the HOA. I turned to her, stepped forward, and held up my badge. "Karen, I'm authorizing it. We're executing warrants related to multiple criminal offenses connected directly to people you allowed, illegally, to operate out of this neighborhood. Including my driveway." She blinked twice, squinted, and then tilted her head. "You're what?" I raised the badge higher. "County Sheriff. I've been living here the whole time. And you've been leasing my property to felons." Her face drained of color. She lowered the phone slowly, the lens no longer steady. "You never said you were a sheriff," she said, suddenly quiet. "You never asked," I replied deadpan. "But you certainly didn't hesitate to sell off something that wasn't yours." She took a step back and tried to regain composure. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was only trying to raise money for the HOA. You should be thanking me for the improvements I've been working on." I stared at her, unsure if she was delusional or just scrambling for a way out. "Karen, you created fake policies, forged board votes, and knowingly took cash from individuals under investigation for organized theft. You obstructed property rights and facilitated criminal activity. You're not getting a thank you. You're getting arrested." The officers moved in, informing her she was being detained for questioning. She tried to spin it again, flailing as they took her phone and began reading her rights. "This is harassment. This is a political hit job. I'm a leader in this community." But her words fell flat, muffled by the zip of cuffs and the gasps of stunned neighbors watching from their porches. The woman who once handed out $20 fines for leaving trash bins out too long was now being walked down the driveway she thought she owned, escorted by deputies. I stood silently as she passed, not out of coldness, but because the weight of what she had done spoke louder than anything I could have said. She looked at me one last time and hissed, "You set me up?" I leaned in just enough for only her to hear. "No, Karen. You set yourself up the moment you put strangers in a sheriff's driveway." As dawn broke, the arrest vehicles pulled away, leaving behind a stunned silence in their wake. Neighbors began approaching, some confused, others apologetic. One older woman handed me a tray of muffins, saying she never liked Karen's attitude but didn't know how deep the rabbit hole went. Another man offered to help repaint the fence Karen had fined me for. One by one, they came forward, wanting to talk, to share their own stories about how she'd abused her power. A man admitted she'd threatened to tow his mother's wheelchair van for being too long. A woman confessed Karen had charged her a cleaning fee for having chalk drawings on her driveway from her grandkid. Everyone had a story. And now, everyone had questions. I told them all the same thing. The investigation would take its course, but the reign of fake rules and clipboard tyranny was over. Within 24 hours, the local news picked up the story. Karen's mugshot aired on every evening broadcast, sandwiched between weather forecasts and county election ads. The narrative was irresistible: a rogue HOA president leasing private property to criminals, busted by the sheriff who lived next door. It became a viral headline overnight. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood. Some neighbors ducked them, while others gave candid interviews about the absurdity of the past year. Meanwhile, I returned to work, filing the last of the incident reports, logging evidence, and preparing for court appearances. But the moment that stayed with me most wasn't the arrest, or even the news. It was walking back into my house, sun barely up, and seeing my wife standing in the kitchen in pajamas, holding a cup of coffee with a single raised eyebrow. I smiled and said, "It's over." She nodded once. "Took you long enough." We both laughed. The nightmare of the leased driveway, the fake citations, the cones, the signs, all of it was finally behind us. Karen thought she could bully a neighborhood into submission, that nobody would ever question her clipboard or challenge her authority. But she picked the wrong house. And more importantly, the wrong driveway. The neighborhood didn't look the same after that morning. The echo of Karen's arrest still hung in the air like the residue of a bad storm. The HOA board was in complete disarray, with only one member left who wasn't under investigation or already halfway out the door. The clubhouse remained locked, the petty emails stopped flooding inboxes, and for the first time in months, you could actually take out your trash without worrying about a violation slip pinned to your bin. People started opening their windows again, walking their dogs without fear of being told their leash was non-standard, and waving at neighbors they hadn't spoken to since Karen declared lawn gnome decorations a public nuisance. It was quiet, yes, but it was the kind of quiet that came with relief, like breathing easy after holding your breath too long. A week after her arrest, the county stepped in to formally freeze all HOA operations pending an audit. They brought in a temporary administrator to sort through the mess. The guy looked like he hadn't blinked in hours, probably buried in fraudulent receipts and half-baked policies with Karen's name scribbled all over them. Meanwhile, I kept a low profile, doing what I always did, my job. I attended court hearings related to the sting, testified where needed, and helped wrap up the last loose ends of the converter theft ring that Karen had accidentally helped enable. A few of the renters she'd brought in flipped under questioning, exposing even more names. It was incredible, really, how one woman's obsession with authority had unknowingly opened the floodgates for organized criminals. I didn't gloat. I didn't brag. I just made sure the case was airtight and the facts were irrefutable. But what I did do, and perhaps enjoyed a little too much, was turn my driveway into something symbolic. I installed a freshly painted sheriff's badge mural at the foot of the concrete, the exact spot where Karen had planted her fake, reserved HOA parking sign. It wasn't big, just enough to be seen by anyone driving by. Below it, I embedded a small bronze plate into the cement that read, "Private property. No leases. Ever." Neighbors came by to snap photos. A few brought lawn chairs just to sit and watch, half expecting Karen to come storming down the street again. She didn't. She was still being processed, her court dates pushed further as new charges were added. Fraud, property rights violations, obstruction, and accessory to criminal activity. As for the HOA itself, it didn't survive. After years of unchecked power and increasingly absurd rules, residents voted overwhelmingly to dissolve the organization altogether. In its place, a volunteer-run neighborhood council was formed. No fines, no tickets, just monthly meetings and open forums. I didn't volunteer, but I attended the first one. It was held on someone's front lawn, with folding chairs, lemonade, and a general air of freedom. One neighbor joked that we should rename the community Karen Free Estates. The laughter was real, and for the first time, so was the sense of community. Somehow, though, it wasn't enough for me to let it end there. There was still one piece of irony I couldn't resist. I decided to host a driveway fundraiser, but not for the HOA or any sort of community improvement. This one was for the local youth law enforcement mentoring program, the same one Karen once described as aggressively inappropriate for suburban culture. I put up a single post online. One-day parking pass at the famous sheriff's driveway. Includes signed copy of HOA violation. I added a photo of Karen's original fake citation, with her phony signature front and center. The post went viral overnight. People offered ridiculous amounts, but I capped the winning bid at a reasonable number. Just enough to cover uniforms and training supplies for 30 kids in the program. The winning bidder? one of the former HOA board members who had resigned after discovering Karen's deception. He parked his car in the driveway, stood next to the badge mural, and took a photo holding Karen's fake ticket like it was a trophy. It was glorious. In the months that followed, my driveway became more of a landmark than I ever expected. People slowed down as they passed, some waved, others took selfies. But more importantly, it stayed empty. No cones, no strangers, no unauthorized leases. Just a clean, peaceful stretch of concrete that belonged, once again, to the family who owned it. My wife eventually planted a few flowers along the edges. My son started drawing with chalk again, this time without someone threatening to fine us for graffiti. The space had gone from battleground to sanctuary, and I had no intention of ever letting it be used for anything other than what it was meant for, home. But of course, karma wasn't quite done. One evening, several months after the incident, I was out with my wife celebrating her birthday when we stopped at a nice restaurant downtown. We pulled up to the valet stand, handed over the keys, and stepped inside. Halfway through dinner, the waiter came over and whispered that our car was ready, but that we might want to come take a look. I excused myself and walked outside, and there she was, Karen, standing in a valet vest, holding our keys with a look of pure horror on her face. She must have picked up the job recently, likely one of the few places willing to hire her after the charges became public. She recognized me instantly and froze. I took the keys, said nothing, and turned to leave. As I slid into the driver's seat, I gave her a smile through the window. It wasn't smug, just one of quiet satisfaction. She'd gone from leasing out driveways she didn't own to parking cars she didn't recognize. Full circle. We pulled away slowly, the city lights blurring past us. My wife asked, "Was that really her?" I nodded. "Yep. Life's funny like that." She laughed, shook her head, and turned up the music. And just like that, we drove off into a chapter of life where Karen was nothing more than a cautionary tale and a closed case file. The lesson? Never let your ego write checks your clipboard can't cash. And definitely don't lease out the driveway of a sheriff who knows exactly how and when to return the favor.